Hey Sean, how's it going today?
Great. How are you, Tiff?
I'm good. I am extra thankful for your flexibility and chillness today because for those of you tuning in, I pinged Sean to do this live about, I don't know, an hour ago or so. We just kind of decided. So thank you for being here.
For sure. For sure. Yeah. Happy to do it and always love chatting with you. So, this is going to be great.
I'm really excited too. And today, we're going to be talking about tasks that you need to complete before you launch a website. And you actually wrote a blog post that I was reading through on this. So I was really excited to sit down with you and connect because I think whether you are an individual developer, meaning building projects for yourself for freelancing purposes, or you work at a large organization, this is a topic that really can apply to you.
Absolutely. Yes. And I'm pulling up my list as well so that I've got them in front of me. But yes. Okay. So, totally agree. And I wrote this post a couple months ago, and I've had many conversations like this over the years. And It and like various ways of tackling these things. Often it was a pre-launch checklist, but that would be very contextualized to each individual client or website that we were launching. And this particular post was kind of an abstraction of that process. I've gone through this so many times over the years. I've noticed a few kind of common tasks or buckets of tasks that we would have to complete to make sure that a website is really buttoned up and ready to go. And a lot of the things in this list are they're really easy to overlook. I think it's there's this, I don't know what the exact saying is, but something like the last 20% of a project takes 80% of the time, or it's something like that. And it's so true because it's the really fun part of a project is the beginning. It's really easy to fly. You see a website come to life really, really quickly early on, and it feels like every line of code you write is doing something really meaningful for that site. And then you get to this last 10 or 20% or so, and it just seems like it takes a lot more code to do a lot less work, or it at least feels that way. And so I think the effect of that is this feeling of, hey, I really want to get to production. And often that's coupled with a lot of pressure from a client or a manager or internal stakeholder or whomever it is to get to that deadline, to meet the deadline, to launch the site. And so you're so motivated often by getting a project done that it can be really easy to cut corners to say, hey, I'm going to do this after this site launches. And in some cases, that might be okay. And some of the things that I have on my list, yeah, okay, you could overlook them, you could come back to them. But the reality is, anybody who's launched a website knows that if you keep a to do in your code, you're probably not going back to that code because the pressure to launch, it's not going to go away.
I know.
So quick, that's kind of an overarching summary of the motivation for why I wrote this. And that I feel like if we're diligent and can make time in our schedule before we launch to get these things in, you're going to launch a much better project as a result.
100%. I can totally attest to the saying you're going to come back to it only to, if we're being honest, sometimes never do, or the tech debt comes back and haunts us at a later point in a different sprint or whatnot. So definitely can relate to that. And I think too, I know we need to dive into this list, but I think too, one thing to note too is that you kind of were getting at as well is it's not just as much as it is a developer's, sometimes they need to be held accountable for this as well. I think sometimes the responsibility also lies on the project managers or the stakeholders when there is this really huge amount of pressure to complete the project in a very quick amount of time. Some things, which you said, they should be put first, but how do you find that balance with limited time? You need to get these features done, but also to incorporate some of these tasks we're going to talk about today, that you're not overlooking them till last minute.
Yeah, that's a great question, and I feel like we could do a whole other show on scheduling and planning the whole like website building process.
Yeah.
But the first idea that comes to mind is that as the technical lead on a project, or even a developer who's reporting to a technical lead, that you have a responsibility, I think, to build a little bit of cushion in your own schedule. That developers are notoriously optimistic, and it, there are all kinds of pieces of advice on how to estimate your time. I found that I usually try to take a conservative estimate and then I double that estimate of how long the time is going to take. And so I'll kind of pause there because I think we could go far in depth, but to more specifically answer your question, if you as a developer are going to take on the responsibility of being a little bit more conservative with your scheduling, one thing you could do is put a deadline on yourself that precedes the deadline that the stakeholder or person, the manager of the project, is going to push on you. As an example, when I worked for an agency, we had a deadline that we would publicize and share with the client. We also had a deadline that was a week or two earlier, and we just called it our internal deadline. And we really worked hard to meet that deadline because we knew the whole week was going to be just cleaning stuff up. And a lot of the things that we find in this list that we're talking about could be squeezed into that week. Now, often that's not even the case. It's that time can be taken up by things that you're discovering through QA, and it's really just buttoning up. Um, it's usually just buttoning up things that a client can actually see on the website. So I would even be more conservative. And if there's even an internal deadline, go earlier with that for a personal deadline and like get to a spot before you're cleaning stuff up where you can say, hey, I'm going to dedicate a couple days to getting these tasks done that always slip that always slip through the cracks.
Exactly. I like that. Yeah. I feel like future episode, we'll dive into it more, but that's a great start for it. Even too, in a future episode, we could bring on like a project manager.
Oh, I love that. Yes.
Super interesting. But for today, let me share my screen and let's talk about, do you think I should share my screen to share the blog post? Do you think that's the best way to do it, Sean, or should we just talk about it?
You can do it. And I know we'll get all three individual feeds that we can download. So probably good for live viewers to have the context, and then we can split it up however we want later.
Perfect. I'm going to start at the top though, just so everyone can see, and I'll scroll down. It just looks it's the layout's so nice. I just got to, give the full effect.
Thanks.
Okay, let's start with number one, performance. I was reading I'll let you dive into it in a sec here, but I was reading some of the tools that you suggested, and a lot of them I haven't, Google PageSpeed I have, but the other ones I haven't heard about. So I'd love to hear your thoughts around performance, and then also too, if you can touch on some of these tools that you list as well.
For sure. So I imagine that most developers have heard, that performance is important, and it's definitely true. And I don't go into a ton of detail here, but you can do a quick Google search, and you'll quickly find that. What should I say? You'll quickly find that there are a number of examples about how 100 milliseconds can affect whether or not folks are going to complete a purchase or not. And I think this probably matters a little bit less on your personal blog than it might on, say, Amazon.com or Walmart.com. In fact, I think one of the studies, I don't remember the exact numbers, but I think Walmart did a study, or someone did a study on Walmart, and it was something like 300 seconds was going to, or 300 milliseconds was going to cost them something like millions of dollars in sales if they could cut their performance by what seems like such a minuscule amount. So for really big organizations and really big sites, it has performance has a tremendous impact. And I'm not doing this section justice at all. I think there's a lot of data to back that up.
Yeah.
But that is to say, it's important everywhere. I mean, even for this site that we're looking at, which is my personal blog site, I want people to be able to load it quickly, and get the information they need, and then be able to move on and solve their problem. And so there are architectural decisions that I could make to improve that performance. But this task here is suggesting that you can wire up something to measure that performance and give you very specific tasks on ways to improve that performance. And you can wire this up. In fact, a lot of the items we see in this list, you could actually wire up into a continuous integration process, so that every time you deploy code, you're running some of these tests, you're making sure that these things are in place. In fact, I believe I have a related post around the same time period that goes into some of these opportunities for just like regular production deployment checks. And this is one of those things. That said, if you don't wire it up, one thing that I really like to do before launching a project is at least test the performance of the homepage and try to get that into the green. Now, Google Page Speed Insights uses Lighthouse, which is another Google product, and that's generally considered like the de facto standard. In fact, Google has, I think, somewhat recently released this newer approach called the Core Web Vitals, which is kind of a health score of the performance of your website, among other factors as well. And I'm not an expert in this area, but yeah, Core Web Vitals is it's generally this like agreed upon standard for if you can meet these Core Web Vitals, then your website is generally healthy, performant, accessible, available, etc. And so Google Page Speed Insights, and it paired with Lighthouse or however you want to wire this up, can give you those scores as well. And then Pingdom and GTmetrix, I don't have as much familiarity with. In fact, I believe that these made their way here from the fact that this blog is open source and people can suggest changes to it, which I think is very cool. I did look at both of them to make sure that they were legit and tested my site against them, got some good recommendations. So I don't personally use Pingdom or GTmetrix, and I'm sure there are dozens and dozens of other tools out there. But yeah, but that's about it. And I'll occasionally run regular performance tests against this site using Google Page Speed Insights.
Yeah. And I think it's definitely one of those things when it comes to performance and page speed that is so often forgot about not till it's too late. I never want to say too late, because it's never too late, but too far down the line. I know, I remember when I was working at a large tech company or a larger tech company, one of the things was we would have, it wasn't a whole sprint, but it was, I'm not even kidding you, there were multiple days dedicated to this exact issue, where what the developers were doing were literally, we were replacing images, refactoring some code, taking out old code. It was basically doing a cleanup for the purpose of performance. And it's a headache when you're going back to do it versus if you're actually checking it off and as you are iterating and building.
Yes. And you kind of uncover this other topic, which is something I'm interested in. And I recently interviewed Henri Helvetica in another show who spends his whole day thinking about performance. And one of the topics we talked about in that show was who's responsible for making sure that a website is performant. You know, if it's your site, obviously it's going to be you. But if you work on teams of people, a site that needs teams of people to build, who's actually
Yeah.
responsible for it? And I think there are some bigger teams out there that will dedicate folks specifically to focusing on performance. But in a lot of cases, that doesn't exist. And to be able to execute this properly might actually require a bit of a culture change in
Yeah.
saying, hey, maybe every developer is responsible for this. Maybe we really should wire up a performance check before anything goes into production. And if it doesn't meet some minimum benchmark, then your code doesn't make it into production.
Yeah.
And I think historically have not cared as much about performance on the web as we should, except in those extreme cases.
Mm.
But I'm getting this sense that things are changing, and this will evolve, and especially as it becomes easier to measure performance, that we'll see more folks, more teams caring about it a little bit more.
Yes, exactly. And for anyone who is watching this now or afterwards, I'll also, Sean, not only will I link this blog post, but I'll also link that video you just mentioned, that interview, because it sounds really interesting. I know we spoke about it offline prior as well, but for anyone who wants to read more, or sorry, not read, watch more about it, I'll link it as well.
Great.
All right, let's move on to my worst nightmare. Sean's laughing because grammar is not my strong suit, but that's an excuse. There's no reason why it shouldn't be, but it's something that I struggle with often. So, misspelled words.
Misspelled words. And for the record, these are just arbitrarily numbered.
Yeah.
They're not in order of importance or anything. And so I'll preface this by saying how much you care about this can be contextualized to, I mean, how much you or whoever is involved in your website cares about this. And there's, like, for example, at
Mhm.
StackBit, we're moving really fast. The product moves really fast. I'm generally responsible for writing the documentation that follows product releases. I'm moving really fast. We often are moving so quickly that I don't really even have anybody to review the content that I've written. I just need to put it out there and keep going. And when I write blog posts, I do the same thing. These are personal posts for my site. I just write them, put them out there, and keep going. And if I have a typo or so, generally that's probably okay, and folks are going to roll right over it. If if you have a habit of typos or bad grammar or anything like that, then I think it's definitely a bit more valuable to put some energy into trying to curb that, and not necessarily with just another human looking at them. And so when I write, I use Grammarly, which is it's an amazing tool. It's really it uses AI to suggest changes, and I'll accept maybe 80% of those changes. It's pretty solid. That said, that's a lot of usage, and there's some spelling in there, but this is kind of more holistically how do you check spelling, and how do you do that for projects that involve multiple developers working together on a team? And I have only just brushed the surface of this, but
Mhm.
personally, I use this tool called C-Spell, and it's pretty cool because it has this integration with VS Code, and you've got some configuration there to make it more or less noisy based on how in your face you want it to be. But C-Spell also has this CLI component to it as well. So I mentioned continuous integration earlier. As you're running your CI tests, you can actually check for code spelling. I mean, it can be code spellings. It could also be content spellings. And theoretically, you could, even if you have content in some headless CMS somewhere, you could theoretically use that same tool or multiple other tools to check to make sure all your spelling is correct. Now, C-Spell is not going to be as elaborate as a Grammarly, and you're not going to have usage or grammar instructions as much. It's going to be kind of strictly spelling.
Mhm.
But that can be helpful as well. You feed it this array of accepted words, and then it has its own dictionary that you can specify, and basically gives you warnings or errors, and can even fail your build if it finds something that isn't in that array of that safe list or list of accepted words. So we've listed at number 2, and it's probably, in terms of importance, much farther down the list, but it's also probably something that almost everybody overlooks and doesn't, and just kind of,
Yeah.
we make typos and we move on unless somebody calls them out.
It's so true. C-spell. Okay, I'm gonna have to look that up, that extension up, 'cause that sounds really interesting. Very useful too.
For sure. Yes. Yes.
Broken links. When I saw this one, it makes me think of how you have actually integrated. I'll let you speak more about it, but I know I have the Slack channel where if a link is broken in our docs, we get a notification in Slack for how you integrated it. So that's what this makes me think of, the importance of looking for broken links.
Absolutely, yes. So we've had some internal debates at Stackbit, which have been really interesting, that have centered around, when do you actually check for broken links and how do you check for broken links? And so what you're referring to, Tiff, is that there's this task that runs nightly and basically scrapes the entire site, including external URLs, and looks for links to be broken and sends us a message in Slack if there are. Well, it sends us a report summary in Slack, and will tell us if there are any broken links, how many links were good, and also how many links it skipped for whatever reason. Now, again, like performance, since we're talking about pre-launch tasks, this can be a one-time thing, and you just make sure you're good to go live. And the tools that I've listed here, Screaming Frog, Link Tiger, Dead Link Checker, these are all tools where you can they'll recursively search your site that is staged and ready to go to production, and can tell you if you have any broken links. And that's like a nice, easy, no code solution. And you can do it once, you can do it multiple times. There are also many, many tools, particularly, I'm used to working with Node.js. So lots of Node.js tools that you can use to write your own scripts that, again, you run in CI or before every build, or also regularly to check for whether you have broken links or not. And so, as I mentioned, there's a question to when you should check for broken links.
Yeah.
And as I mentioned here, that these are right before what the context of this particular post is pre-launch, but you can test every time you are going to deploy to production or going to change content or whatever it might be. And like I mentioned in the previous point, you can also check for broken links against a headless CMS. You just have to be able to pull that content into your test in some way. The reason there's even a discussion here about whether you check every time or not is because it takes some time, and that the amount of time it takes is generally based on, I found it to be based on 2 factors. The first is the more obvious one, which is, how big is your site? The more pages you have in your site, the longer it's going to take to check all the links, because generally the way these things work is you will give it one page, which is typically your home page. It crawls that page, looks for every link on that page, pings it to make sure that it gets a 200 status code response. And then it follows that link if it's internal, so that it eventually kind of like crawls and recursively checks every page on your site, as long as there's a link to it from some page in the tree that started from your homepage. So if you have thousands, hundreds of thousands of pages, that's going to take a while, and you're going to delay your build for something that you might not consider to be mission critical.
Yes.
The second piece that affects the length of time is whether or not you test external links. And you should definitely test external links in some way. But if you add external links to it, you are also you are increasing the amount of time
Yeah.
you're spending to test. And I would say, going back to the performance piece, you're also the response on those websites is generally
Yeah.
unpredictable because you don't know if folks are prioritizing performance or
Mhm.
not. Um, and so there are a number of ways that you can spin this. I
Mhm.
think that you probably what you want to do is come up with some definition for what you feel like is a critical broken link that needs to be addressed. So
Mhm.
that could be a link on the homepage. It could be your top 5% of blog posts or just pages in general. And then you just feed it a list and don't recursively check throughout your site and check everything. And then you get it done in a few seconds. And so find that minimum threshold and probably check that at least before you release to production. So you have some confidence in your mission critical um, paths and content when you are publishing. And then secondarily, I think that regularly, which is probably daily, but at least weekly, I would probably daily, that you run some test that does recursively crawl at your entire site, checks internal links and external links, and then sends you some report or notification if it finds broken links. So even if it's on a page that isn't visited, you can update that. And this has come in, this has been so handy for me. I mean, just last week, I found a link that popped up in StackBit just from some JavaScript tool injecting a link on the page. And we're like, okay, well, why is this happening? And we uncovered some other issue because of the broken link, which is really cool. But it's also really important because because particularly for external links, you don't have any control over whether that link is good or not. And so
Mhm.
regularly checking for that will notify you if your users are going to get 404 responses for some link. And then you can decide to either remove the link or change it if it breaks at some point.
It's so true. And it's one of those things where as your site grows and you naturally have more links, you need this more, but it also becomes more of a challenge for the reasons you mentioned as well. So it's definitely, it sounds when you're scrolling through broken links, oh, no problem. But when you really take a step back and think about it and explain like you just did, you realize how much of a challenge or issue at times this can be if it's not taken care of.
100%. 100%. Totally agree.
I know we have a bunch. I'm curious. I was going through this and I can't remember. Do you have, because one that was, I know we're almost out of time here, but one that was big, a big pain point for I experienced at my last dev job was accessibility. And I know this varies company to company, but I was working on a site for an airline and we had to have, after the site was, I mean, it's been built for a while, but we had to go back and make the entire site accessible from keyboard to voice commands or oh, what is it? Uh, so the user could hear what element they are on.
Right.
Um,
Yeah.
so audio. So that was something that it's so simple. Once you do it, it's ingrained in you. You're like, okay, I always know to include an ARIA label or ARIA placeholder. But it's not something that for me, when I was learning how to code or went to a coding boot camp, no one ever, I think it's something that's still kind of second thought, which is interesting. So I'd be curious to hear your thoughts around accessibility as well.
For sure. Do you want me to just breeze over the
Let,
other ones and then we'll end on accessibility?
let's do it. Yeah. Yeah.
Okay, great. So third-party analytics tools, I feel like it's very tightly coupled to performance um it's interesting. It's so the takeaway here is you're especially if you're building a site for someone else,
Mhm.
um, make sure you're putting all their marketing tools in the site. But and if you're releasing a personal site, I mean, at least add Google Analytics or something
Yeah.
relevant to that. If if at some point you think in the future you're going to want to use that information. But the thing I wanted to call out here is check off that you've added everything. And then after you add it, go back and check performance, because this is one of the factors that will really, really hurt performance. Whoops,
Yes.
I lost my video feed. What happened? Oh, yeah. Okay.
I can hear you still. I just can't see you.
Look at all these, the problem of having too many fancy pieces of technology running at one time. All right, there's that. Let's see. Okay. Okay. I'll go to my other camera if we can't get this up and rolling in a minute.
Awesome. But yeah, as you're doing that, that is such a good note to add in there about rerunning or running your page for speed performance after you've added these third-party tools in, because sometimes that is one of the last steps you do. So if you've already ran a speed test, it's like you said, it's going to heavily impact that.
For sure. Absolutely. Okay, let's see if we get anything. There we go. Progress. And I need to use, I have this fancy external camera, and so I use 3 different pieces of software to be able to run the feed from the camera to the computer. And usually,
Mhm.
I mean, this is the first time I've actually had issues with it, but anyways, there we go. All right,
Super.
everything's fine. Okay, so 5, 6, and 7, I think, are all related to SEO in one way or another. So you've got a sitemap, and then robots text, and then I think SEO meta tags. Yep. So this is all, it's all basically about making your site visible and
Mhm.
visible to search engines, and adding enough information so search engines know what each page is about. And all of these things are generally really easy to do, and also generally really easy to overlook. The sitemap probably takes a little bit more effort, especially if you're using some framework that doesn't inherently have that ability built in. But most server-side languages have the ability to build these things super simple. And also, I mentioned something that can do this automatically, xmlsitemaps.com.
Nice. Perfect.
Robots.txt is a way to be able to tell search engines to crawl or not crawl different pages on your site. And then SEO meta tags are just various HTML tags that the search engines use, but also social sharing sites
Mm.
use. So there's an Open Graph protocol, which was started by Facebook, that many other services use today. And then and Twitter has their own protocol as well. And so that is, I mean, especially when I'm working with client websites, super easy to overlook, and you got to really pester people to fill that information in. But it is so super important. What you can do is provide some sensible defaults for SEO meta tags. So if your page has say a title field, then by default, you make that the title tag for your page, but also let people override that if they need to. Okay. Number 8, and what's number 9? I think these kind of go together. Yep. 8, 9, and what's 10?
10 is, we have accessibility.
Okay. So 8 and 9 are really just about, and we mentioned this at the beginning of the show, remove the stuff that you put in there for development purposes. For whatever reason, I mean, this happens all the time, but to-dos and code are one thing it's generally pretty easy to use. You just search for to-do and then do them or don't do them and get rid of them. But you don't leave stuff hanging, or at least move it into some task in your project management system. And then I say remove comments. How you handle comments is totally up to you and your team, and how you want to work. I tend to leave comments in my site. I put this here just because it's, consider it based on your team and your process. And placeholder text. This can be anything from, you had a link that you put into behind your behind your Instagram icon because you didn't know what the client's Instagram account was, or they didn't have one yet and they were going to create one. And so then I mean, you would theoretically catch that probably if you're checking for broken links, but also placeholder text or images or whatever you might have used before you had real content. This is just kind of an extra way, an extra step that says, hey, go check the whole site again and make sure that there's no placeholder content, images, etc. So that's kind of how those group together. And then what's number 11? So we can do accessibility last. Formatting code. I love this. It's a pet peeve of mine, and there's tons of products out there. Prettier is my favorite. ESLint and StyleLint for JavaScript and CSS if you want to use those instead. And this is another task that can get hooked into your continuous integration pipeline to make sure that code is consistently formatted against some configuration, and it just keeps things clean and easy to read and super consistent.
Exactly. Okay. And we, and on the note of Prettier, we did last week a live where we went through some VS Code extensions. And one of the ones that you mentioned was Prettier. And for those tuning in, if you want to kind of take a deeper dive in extensions that we spoke about, but also Prettier, I'll link that down below because Sean, you give some really interesting insight. Even though Prettier is so widely used, there were some tips that you gave for that extension that I wasn't familiar with. So definitely worth going to check out as well.
Yes, it must be a little bit anal retentive about my code formatting because I do love Prettier.
No, it's good. And then 10, accessibility. Here we go.
Okay, so you asked about this earlier. Yes, I feel like this falls in a really similar category to performance, which is that it's traditionally not been as important as it really should be. It makes the web accessible to everybody, particularly users with disabilities that would otherwise have trouble accessing your website or simply being able to use the website. And so, you mentioned screen readers. That's and having the right attributes on your HTML elements to be able to let screen readers do what they do. And there are these various different metrics that can the WCAG, so the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines. These guidelines provide that benchmark for what is accessible or what is acceptable with accessibility. And here I'm also not an expert. I just know it's important and that there are different levels of care and attention that you can give to your website. And generally what I've done is address the things that are more easy to target just by reading the code. Mm-hmm. So you mentioned those ARIA labels or ARIA attributes in your HTML. And that's something that definitely do that. And there are plenty of services in whatever server-side language you're using that can just scan all your markup and tell you where something is missing. Like where is there an image where you don't have an alt tag? And where's there a button where you don't have a proper label, or a form field where there isn't a label on screen, so you need to add a label as an attribute? Those kind of things are super easy to detect and really easy to fix. Mm-hmm. There are other more challenging aspects that are difficult to measure and sometimes also arguably a little bit harder to resolve. An example might be the visual color contrast on your screen.
Yes.
So this page we're looking at here is very much black and white, but I did in a few, which is the acceptable, that's like the maximum contrast that you can have on a web page. I believe on this site, I ran into a few issues where like that green color, I think at one point was lighter. And so that presents a challenge because if your your brand can make it really difficult to be properly accessible as it comes to color based on the combinations that you want to present on your website. So I previously had this green where if I wanted to use it as a button, I couldn't really use white text or black text on it and have this acceptable contrast level between the two. So I ended up doing a darker variation of the brand color to be able to meet these accessibility guidelines. So that's just one example, and it goes really deep. And like performance, I mean, you can dedicate a team to it. You
Yeah.
can spend a lot of time making your site really accessible, and the impact it's going to have is proportional to your user base for sure. But I also feel like there's some baseline somewhere that you, that just like being a good human, you
Yeah.
can do these things that don't take very long that make your site accessible to everyone. And so I think at least meet that minimum.
Mhm.
Use those tools that can programmatically check your site, read your markup, and add those proper attributes.
I like that. To end this stream, be a good human.
Be a good human. Yes, yes.
This list is so I absolutely loved going through this list and just hearing your further thoughts around it. I know it's there in writing, but just even expanding on some of them. So thank you so much, Sean. As I mentioned, I'll link this down below as well for anyone who wants to check out not only this article, but also to other posts on Sean's blog. Sean, I guess unknowingly today I'm pushing your blog.
Hey, it's all right. I appreciate it, and I love talking about these things, and I feel like this is a really great format to be able to expand on some of those topics, because I'm generally, at least lately, everything I've written in the last year or so, except with a few exceptions, most of them are they're quick and to the point, and and giving you kind of a jumping off point, and and we're and so this is kind of a great
Yeah.
form to say, like, we started there, we're expanding on it. I like to think of it as, musical artists they can release this song that is really structurally simple, but also really great. I think of like the song Yesterday by the Beatles.
Mhm.
It's like it's the perfect song, but it's also super, super simple. And for that reason, it's been covered thousands of times, changed in so many ways, elaborated on it. And so yeah, this is like building our own cover version to Cliff Notes, more or less.
I like that. And if we wanted to, as an idea, which I'm curious to hear others' thoughts as they tune in afterwards and whatnot. If we wanted to continue to take it one step further, say in this use case, we could even bring on individuals who who specialize in these areas. Like you said, these areas each in themselves have so many developers or specialists who go really deep into it, and hearing about someone who maybe really studies and is an expert in accessibility or performance, like I know you had that conversation with an individual who is an expert in performance, and it's just really fascinating to hear maybe even further. So that's the next step maybe.
Yeah, and it came up a few times in this talk, um, where we kind of differentiated between how you might approach one of these items
Yeah.
if you have this massive enterprise problem that you're solving versus if you're building it for a personal blog. And I would say that my blog site is usually catering people with smaller sites, smaller to medium sites, and at Stackbit, we're generally solving really big problems for enterprises a lot of times. So it could also be interesting to, even though I did that show with Henri, we could that was just general performance. We could bring him in to talk specifically about performance at the enterprise level, which I think has a lot more nuance to it than it does if you're just talking about how to get your Lighthouse scores green for your
Yeah.
portfolio website.
I like that. Okay, I think that's a future video. I'm putting it out there.
All right. Love it. Love it.
Thanks for everything today, Sean. I will see you next week.
Fantastic. See you next time, Tiff.
Bye.